So halito sa hachapia Brit Reed to the Michalusa Sia to the actually adoptee Micha descendant Sia and Seattle, Washington, Adali Took, Dallas, Texas, Adali. So my name is hello. My name is Brit Reed. I am Choctaw and Black. I am an adoptee and also I go by descendant just because I'm on enroll because of complications with adoption. And I used to live in Seattle. Actually, used to live in Tulalip, Washington, utterly took. And then I now live in Dallas, Texas, which is closer to my tribe.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us. I do want to apologize. I've been getting over a cough. Yeah, but thank you for joining us. And I'm very excited to have you join, and I'm glad you're able to make it. I hope your move has been smooth, and definitely as we're talking about like land and food connection and the different work that you do, it's kind of like a nice way to wrap up our blog post series, especially because you were here and then you're closer to your tribe now, right?
Yeah.
So I was kind of like thinking about like our first question. If you could tell us what food means to you and having access to traditional food means to you as well.
Okay. I'll try to answer these as concisely as I can because I feel like it's a big, long story. But for me being an adoptee, one, like I started initially kind of diving into traditional foods when I was at the Evergreen State College in my undergrad. There used to be a program called the Reservation-Based Community Determined Program, which has since been renamed Native Pathways. And we would have, because Evergreen goes by quarters instead of semesters, we kind of had like these rotating programs. And one of those in the res-based program was building healthy communities. And in that particular program, like we went over a number of different things, which included kind of like what happens when people are forcibly removed from their traditional and or healthy food. So living in, food apartheid and food deserts, people prefer food apartheid now. And so that kind of got me into the, like, kind of wondering about that. And then when I got invited initially to go out to Sundance, I started learning more about like traditional foods out there as it came into a role over the years of being one of the head cooks out there at our family camp and getting to know my uncle parents and like different folks, like with my spiritual family, getting more and more into that. And so I definitely brought that back into like my academic work initially, and then spent my time in the MPA tribal, specifically looking at traditional foods and continuing like what happens when people, are forcibly removed from our foodways. So I have like an academic side to it, but I'm also a gatherer. I've tried my hand at growing. I'm not that good at it. So for me, it gives me like more respect and appreciation for all the people that, are actively growing our foods, as well as like the hunter and the fishermen. Because that's a lot of work. And, being able to like share that feast was really great whenever I was in Tulalip and able to cook for community gatherings up there and to be able to spread that table. Because I used to also be a cook up there, both for their cultural things as well as with the diabetes program at the clinic up there. So I guess to try and like wrap it up, I mean, like traditional foods to me, I think is a way to reconnect with the land and then the waters as well, especially out there, but also like our community and ourselves. It ties into everything that we do. And I feel like there's a lot of things that we do as people that without our foodways could possibly be devoid of a lot of things. Which for me, since I also am part of a project called Inchunwa, which helps to revitalize Southeastern traditional tattoos. And I mean like Southeastern, like Mississippi, not Alaska. Like part of our tattoo practices, some of our designs included our flora and our fauna, so our plants and our animals too. So it's like, if you don't know what that is, then we can't get back to understanding what our tattoos even are, since that's a large component also of those designs. So it kind of ties into everything that we do and how we understand ourselves as people, both spiritually and mentally and physically as well.
No, yeah. It sounds like you have been able to navigate the importance of food sovereignty and like food revitalization and connection and culture through like an academic lens and also like community practice and like your own personal and cultural practices as well. And studied a couple like different works that's happening within community. as well. And to think that that was kind of like banned or illegal way back when, or it's still kind of um, manifests itself in different ways. Like even now, what does food sovereignty mean to you? And you talked about the traditional Choctaw practices in revitalization as well, and how you actually incorporate that in like food um, within what you get tattooed as well.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of access, like you mentioned, in order to get the land, like food has always been part of the warfare against us. And whether that was like physical access, like denying people the ability to go off the reservation to access those things, or like not being able to get the seeds to grow them, or forcibly removing people from one area where you knew the land to be able to go and gather things, versus like, say, like my people, like we were in the Mississippi and like southeastern area, and then got forcibly removed to Oklahoma, which is plains in the southeast where we're at, southeastern Oklahoma. So like that's a completely different landscape there, and like the heat's just different, everything's different. And so I mean, like the curb, I guess, of like figuring out like what seeds would grow in like that environment versus where we came from the ones that people were able to like hide and bring with them on the Trail of Tears. Or like even the different kind of foods are different. So, like people talk about bison, and even when you go to like Durant, which is our headquarters, like there's statues of bison everywhere, but it's the wrong kind of bison. We had like a woodland bison out where we used to be, and they didn't even like come into our territory that much. But I think our understanding of like our foods changed also as we moved. And of course, like that access for a lot of tribes like changed dramatically. Some things like where now people, when they think about traditional foods, they think of fry bread. But I mean, that's kind of what we got handed to us, or like we figured out under the conditions that we were put when we were put on reservations. And when people like, it was dangerous to leave, people got shot at, people got arrested. And then now I think that like our access is different. It's getting better, but I think the knowledge isn't always there about how to like cook healthy foods, even if we have better access to them now, just because of having to be under commodities for so long. And, just like the base knowledge of like, what are our traditional foods? How do you go out and get them? I think that's another possible barrier. Cause like for me, like I've noticed for myself, both when I was living in Washington and now here, now that I live in Texas, I realize that even though I have like a theoretical understanding of my own traditional foods in terms of going out and gathering, it's a lot different when you actually have to put that into practice. And even when I look at like, like movies and stuff that were filmed in Washington or BC, like I can like point out like all these different traditional foods and medicine from up there in the forest that I'm seeing, and recognizing that I have a much better understanding of the food, being able to access those foods out there in the forest and on the edge of the forest out there, because that's like kind of where I came into like, like people graciously taught me up, and like my own like, just trying to learn, like, and I know like where to go look for them. I know the timing of the year, all these different things, which you have to have such a big knowledge base about just being able to go out and gather a certain thing. Like even, for example, going out and getting rose hips, like if you don't know that you need to wait until winter and you go out and you gather those and just bite into it, like there's a reason why it's called itchy butt. But like if you don't know that, like you're in for a surprise. And so I think that that's definitely a barrier for access now, but I think that it's getting better. And same with our seeds. I think that like people like Rowan White and seed keepers are helping us to, they're rematriating a lot of seeds so we can get access to some of those seeds that were lost. And so things are getting better, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And like, I think our challenges for accessing those foods have become a little bit different, but in some places, like the struggle is still the same one that our ancestors had. There's like 3 questions of what you asked. I'm trying to remember like what they all were. But in terms of like the tattoos, like for the Southeastern people, it gets something like, I feel like our revitalization of our ancestral markings is definitely far behind than say like Alaska or California's. But with that being said, like I said, there's some clues, right? Like they said for ours, like in broad description, because there's not a lot of images that they drew out when they came to, air quotations, explore through our area, whether it was the French, the British, or the Americans. And so we kind of have to go back to like older times when we were mound builders to look at like what they had at Moundville, or some of these other sites like the Poverty Point World Heritage Site and Etowah and some other places, to look at like our old pottery and carvings and copper and things like that to see like what the ancestors drew. And those are some of those things that we utilize. But like I said, like knowing what our traditional foods were or medicines and those animals, like I really like what Karina Walters had to say. She was talking about how there was Alaskan youth who was kind of crying around about how like we've lost so much stuff. We lost so much stuff. And the elder turned to that youth and was like, as long as you have the land, like you didn't lose anything. And so for me, like in trying to create a culturally rooted tattoo apprenticeship program, I believe strongly that our apprentices, even though they may not be into cooking food or anything, like they also need to create a relationship with those plants and those animals. And so it's imperative that they're able to like go and be out on the land for sometimes during their apprenticeship program so they can create those relationships and start to understand them. And so I think that's also a vital part of the work as well, or also like go and, try and grow them. Because growing corn is a lot harder than people think. And so like having that experience, and I think it's through that experience and like learning about all of those things that go around it. And like I said, getting that relationship with the plants, I think they can come up with more designs and stuff to be more relevant to today and also kind of sidestep some of the spiritual and protocol issues that some people are starting to have conversations about.
Yeah, definitely. Like as I'm thinking about the seeds and like having access to our foods because of the landscape and how everything has been contaminated, or like even knowing when to go and gather, or like, and I'm thinking about like there's different dishes, like in Pacific Northwest where they cook the fish underground, I think it is. And then also like the food part that's entailed in Sweat Lodge, and even being able to access different regions when people go hiking or gathering, as they call it. I know that there's some restrictions there. And even you talked about the spiritual component within tattoo or doing tattoos, and it was outside, or it's used with certain tools that were provided by the land. So I know that sometimes like food sovereignty is something that's not talked about or really understood. What does that look like, or what does it mean to you, considering that the land has been like harmed, and now that impacts the landscape here, not just here in Washington, but across the Turtle Island as well?
Yeah, I guess we'll define food sovereignty initially, just in case people aren't aware. Food sovereignty, or at least like the definition that like I kind of work from, is the ability of a community to determine their food system. And like I think it's a little easier in Washington State, I've noticed, because I mean, like, even though like when I lived in Tulalip, I'll start from there. Like I was really fortunate to live on the reservation, and at that time, like be a part of a community where like an uncle was part of like the forestry department. And so for us, because, like I was with a family that were members, like all we had to do was just request the key. And then we could go out at the particular times of the season and go gather different things at different areas of the res. And then we knew of like other areas that we could go to go gather, and for some of the family to go and pull cedar and stuff. And so like it was easier. I think because Washington State itself, I think, has a higher regard for the land than say Texas, for example, for many reasons. And so like I know like I could gather with more confidence over there and be self-assured that as long as I did things like don't gather within like 100 or so feet, some people would say 1,000 feet of the road because of heavy metal contaminants or things like that, I'd probably generally be okay. Here in Dallas, I don't trust any place to go gather at all. In fact, I think that to go gather, I'd probably need to go up to Oklahoma because it's a lot more rural up there. Like OKC, like Oklahoma City and Tulsa are kind of the two biggest cities there. And then there's a bunch of smaller towns, like I'm talking like maybe there's a gas station is a lot of the towns in Oklahoma for the vast majority of it. So there's a lot of wild spaces across Oklahoma. And so there's still safety concerns because the KKK is definitely active in Oklahoma. So you have to go out and like buddy system that and just be careful and watchful. But at least I don't have to worry about the land itself being contaminated as much. Because I mean, there's that ridiculous saying, but it's true. Like you are what you eat. And, you don't want to have those contaminants in your system. So that makes it a lot harder. Like I would say for say the Dallas Native community, if they had the knowledge and wanted to go gather, which is definitely, I think we're a little bit further behind here in Dallas than say like Seattle, where people are like, oh, let's go out and get salmon berries. Let's go get nettle. Let's go get like these various things that are, ready spring through fall. But yeah, it's just harder. Definitely don't want to be doing any like urban gathering.
Oh yeah, it's interesting or it's different. Like I spent some time in Texas for grad school, and then I moved here, and I was like, wow, you can actually practice like culture more so here in like Pacific Northwest, right? And it was a bit challenging even in California because it was so urbanized. They're like not just urbanized, but they mass like wiped out the plant relatives, and knowledge is not really there. So it seems like you've been very involved or connected with the family and other elders and aunties and uncles, and being able to work towards asserting food sovereignty and like your cultural rights and feeding communities, so that way you can like revitalize some of these traditional feedings that might have been hibernating, and then sharing a meal, not just like food meal, but like spiritual, emotional, like other ways. So I was curious, like, why did you decide to work towards this?
Well, I mean, like I grew up here, like me and my brother, growing up as kids, like my parents, our adopted parents, like always had us in the kitchen, like stirring stuff or like grating cheese. And like I'm 35, so when I was a kid, it was like the golden era of Nickelodeon, and we were always mad that like we couldn't be like our friends and go like eat dinner in front of the TV because it was like a very important thing for my parents that we always like sat down at the dinner table together and ate, because it could be like our only time as a family. And so nobody could leave the dinner table until everybody was done, which I think I definitely trolled my brother sometimes about that. But, experiencing that helped me to understand like the ways in which eating together can form strong bonds, not only between a family, but a community. And so some of my favorite memories is actually like cooking with people, and also, like sitting together like as like families or communities together, which later on extended out to like whenever I go out and gathering, especially up there, not only going out to get the nettles together as a family, but also to be able to process the nettles, because that makes it go so much faster. Because I've definitely done it myself, and, it took forever versus like, with a group of people, and that'd be done like an hour or two and then everybody gets some. Or we could use it like whenever the family I was with like would put on a feed for a gathering, and be able to provide that to the larger community that was coming from all around, whether that was like Canada or Lummi or, Skokomish or wherever. But I think so too, I've also kind of realized that, like to eat traditional foods is difficult because we don't have the same kind of markets as say like you can getting apples. Like you can't just get it all the time. And so you have to, like I said, you have to like be able to watch the land and know what to look for and where to go to and how to gather in the right way, but also how to process it so you can save it. Because like if you are feeling lazy and don't want to go out and get nettles and they come out, like you missed it, like good luck next year. You got to kind of jump when the land says jump, but also you need to like plan to spend that time preserving it, because otherwise like why go out and get it, because it's all just gonna rot and go away. And so for me, it's really like that community aspect of it, of being able not only to be out on the land, but to be able to, form those relationships with the plants, but also the people that I'm with. And I think that like being of service and gift giving is definitely like a quote unquote like love language of mine. And so I love to be able to feed people, especially knowing that, again, it's like, there's barriers there. And so there's only certain times of the year that people might be able to get access to those foods. And usually it's going to be during just like a special time, because whether or not they can get it, but then also know what to do with it or like how to incorporate it to like their daily lives is kind of hard. I think that like sometimes things like cornmeal might be easier because you can buy those things from like tribal producers, but it's still more expensive than say like getting the masa at the market or like, like whatever cornmeal. And so, just since I do have that knowledge and those skills, like I do like to share that. And if nothing else, be able to cook that so people at least can get access to that. And especially, during times that aren't sad. Because when I was in Tulalip, I had an elder that I worked with, Dale Jones, and he would help out a lot with the funerals. And he said, like most people are getting kind of like a bad association with the food because funerals are becoming the only time that they're able to access them. And we need to have more times where it's happy that people are able to access them. And so I have cooked for memorials a couple of times, but generally it's always been other things. And so I like to be able to offer that that service and ability when I can to cook for, whether it's like a wedding or just cause you wanted to get together or like a family event. That's always a lot nicer and to, not only get that access, but also give those like better associations with the traditional foods as well.
Yeah, so you touched on multiple aspects, and something I've been thinking about, I've been curious about, I've heard from different indigenous and like also non-native community members, and sometimes they do ask like, I don't know how to make it, or if I buy, I want to make sure that it's from a native community member, or like sometimes it's been so commercialized and mass produced by non-native communities, like masa or like other type of seeds or like blue corn or even nettles, how they're like packaged and sold in some Whole Foods, and that kind of takes away, I think, in my humble opinion, from like the spiritual component of it, or even dabbled into Native communities being able to have a relationship. And there's like that relationship of like how it's been mass produced and like the direct connection with the land and like indigenous communities. So, what advice would you give to non-native people who are interested in like learning about native foods or cooking them, or like when they're eating them at different like gatherings, or say that they're not native but they are dating someone who is native and is going to be a parent and wants to raise the child with those foods? What type of advice would you give to them?
Well, I think I'd start actually like speaking to like native people and just know that like I think any way that you can incorporate traditional foods into your diet is a good thing. And it doesn't matter if it's coming from a store, because at least you're getting it like in your food, like in your diet, like I think that like, yeah, like it's kind of like tobacco, right? Like that's been mass produced, but it's still the plant, right? Like it's still like the spirit of the plant is still there and you can still pray to it and honor it in that way. And that's the same thing like with our medicines, right? Like even when it's coming from a pharmacy, like that started initially from like a plant at some point. So it's like honor that. And don't be ashamed, because I mean, like maybe it's just the first step of like you choosing to go and get, like cornmeal or whatever and figure out how to use that, right? That's still a step that like down the road, like if you're able to get that from maybe down the road, somebody that grows it, that like made it into that cornmeal or whatever, or like, nettles or whatever, how to use that, which is like the biggest part of it. So I'd say just start where you're from, because it's, yeah, whatever way you're getting it, it's better than not having it at all and not having that kind of relationship at all. And I know one of the things that was like really powerful that I learned while I was with the diabetes program is that like most people need to interact with a food at least 17 times. And that doesn't mean just tasting it, but that could be like seeing it, smelling it, whatever, 17 times before they might like it. And so at least you're kind of getting that in there, so that, again, you can have that like kind of relationship. And like ultimately it's about like you and your health, like mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. So at least you're helping yourself by getting those in your diet. Definitely like emotionally, and spiritually. But yeah, I would just like take, I mean, if it's like a concern, then just like take that step, right, to like talk to your food and like pray, you know. So like that component's still there, but just know that's like a first step, and that there's always more to learn. There's always more to engage with. I think especially if you're in the Northwest, then like there's ways that you can go out and you can gather in a respectful way. But, you know, a lot of people are still learning about like how to go out and get those in an ethical way, in a way that aligns with like the teachings that we have. And so it's just a journey, and don't be ashamed of it, and just like start where you can. But for non-natives, I think that's kind of like a harder question. I think it's like, what is their way they're trying to get into it, and like, what's their intent? Like, I know when I started food sovereignty as tribal sovereignty, eventually food sovereignty became this kind of fad thing. And especially like with the visibility of like Sean Sherman and Crystal Wapapa and several other Native chefs, myself included, we started seeing a rise of like white Native chefs trying to enter the group, and that's a Native only space. And so I think it's one of those things where it's like you can honor the cuisine that you're at, because every single region in the Americas, like I would say, like the basis of that is like whatever the indigenous people's cuisine was of that place, and then whoever came to settle there, and like what came from like their homelands. And so you're probably already eating traditional foods from that area. I mean, shoot, like 70% of all the world's produce came from the Americas. So technically, every other cuisine in the world is probably like native fusion. I was kind of laugh when people ask me like, what would you consider native fusion? I'm like, everything: Korean food, Italian food, Irish food, like German food. Like y'all are all using potatoes and like chilies and like all these other things, tomatoes. But like even with those ones, I think like a good basis step is like recognize where your food's origins are, and like know that like, yeah, no, those potatoes weren't an Irish thing, that was from here. Those tomatoes aren't an Italian thing, that was from here. You know, the chilies are all from here. I mean, name your thing, chocolate, right? And if there's a thing like cacao, don't steal the ceremonies around it and go sell it. Like, you know, be respectful. Yeah, I mean, like I said, like I would just start, like, even if it's just recognizing what those produce are, like what those foods are that came from here, and then incorporating that more, like that's one good way to do it, because those foods are already everywhere. And so like you don't need to necessarily be going out into the woods and getting nettles and all these other things. Like maybe leave that for the native people. I would also say too, like I have a friend, Carlos Baca, his partner Gretchen, I'm trying to remember her last name, but she's hella dope. She's white. But she made this zine that was talking about like how to ethically forage if you are non-native, and talking about like what are all these plants that came over from Europe that are now invasive species, and maybe like go out and gather those things, because A, those are your traditional foods, and B, like you're helping out the indigenous plants that are from the area to be able to get like the space that they need. So like I think that's like another thing that I would say. But also make sure that like where you're gathering isn't someplace that's tribal land outright. Everywhere is usual and custom land. So I mean, anywhere you're going to gather is native land in general, but like don't be rolled up on reses. And in places that are like obviously like tribal jurisdiction, like don't be rude. And maybe like if native people are coming to like gather with, like be respectful, and like don't steal information. Because I think one of the things that I kind of feel bad about, I feel like it's like a can of worm that myself and everybody else who engaged in this unknowingly kind of opened up, that I didn't learn until like my ex, who worked for the tree department in Tulalip, had to kind of go deal with. I think anytime that we share information about traditional foods or ecological knowledge without like the consent of a tribal government, one of the unfortunate things is that opens it up to other nation states, other companies to say, well, this was just put out there, so like now we can take this information and then copyright it and make it inaccessible, and make it, yeah, just like basically like yeah, just stealing our ecological knowledge and taking it out of the hands of tribal nations and the people from there. And so that's real, and they fight that every single quarter at the gosh, what it was that he was going to. I'm forgetting right now, but it's a subcommittee of the UN. And I have to say, like, from the little bit that I know, it sounds like it's been like a real struggle for, you know, like the indigenous people from all over the world that band together to try and fight this, to make headway on it. So I think that we all should probably learn more about that, and then figure out like what are ways that we can share information that doesn't put it at risk. Because I don't think enough people know about it. And like I said, if I didn't have a partner, an ex-partner that was doing that work, like I wouldn't know about it. But that is the unfortunate can of worms too that we've opened ourselves up to, kind of like in a way like quinoa, for example, like how that was like the base like food of Quechua people, and now like for a long time, like even Quechua people couldn't get access to like their base food because it was like being sold at like, you know, Whole Foods and like all these like super rich first world countries. And that's, yeah, definitely like an unfortunate side effect and thing that we need to like kind of guard against, I guess.
That actually segues into like our last question. What do you foresee as the future of our foodways if we as Indigenous people or Native people do not steward the land? I think I read somewhere that Native people contribute to preserving or stewarding over 86% of the ecological system or something along those lines. And kind of like how you mentioned that sometimes it's been so mass produced and our knowledge systems has been used against us at times, where we can't even access our own food. But I think earlier you mentioned that an elder was telling the youth that it's getting better.
Oh, that was like as long as you have the land that like get it back. Yeah, because things go to sleep. There's still ways to get them back, even if we think that they're gone. I think that we have examples already of what happens when Indigenous people don't steward the land. And like, for example, like with Choctaws and Chickasaws and Muskogees, Seminole to a degree, and Cherokee being moved on the Trail of Tears, like the whole East Coast used to just be like filled with the American chestnut. I mean, that's why we hear the song like, or that lyric like chestnuts roasting over an open fire. It's because there used to be so many chestnuts that they used to like take huge train loads and then ship them up to Northeast markets. But the Chinese chestnut blight came through, and it's now technically, I think, functionally extinct. Like the roots underground are alive, but every time it sprouts, it like gets attacked by the blight. And then now there's like huge, like the way the land looks now is nothing like the way that the ancestors saw it, and that's not even from like people built on top of it land. It's just like there's now different plants that were never there. That with the chestnuts being gone, and these different ecological environments not being the way they were, like it looks completely different. Whether there's like, you know, blackberry brambles everywhere. I mean, we see that in Washington, right? Like, you know, it wasn't like, I think it was like what, maybe like 20, 30 years ago, there weren't all those brambles everywhere, and now like you can't get rid of them. It's wild. And so like the land just changes significantly. But I think on top of that too, you know, we've seen like a loss of diversity of plant life, even just within our agricultural like system. Like, for example, there used to be over 9,000 varieties of corn. And then even in like 1900, there was 1,000 left. And like, how many do we have now? I think that with this work now of trying to seed save and like grow out these traditional seeds, like there's been times there's just been handfuls of them, and then they've been able to like bring it back from there. I think it's like, I know I've heard it from the Echo Hawk sisters that are up there, as well as from Rowan White talking about how like the Pawnee, I think they had like 7 or 9 different varieties of corn. And when they were forcibly removed from Nebraska, they tried to grow them in Oklahoma, but it just like didn't take there because it wasn't the right, you know, land for it. And then working with some of the white folks that had like saved some of the seeds and then growing it out in Nebraska, it came back, but they had lost like, I think it was like a speckled red corn, but through regrowing like this other red corn that they had, all of a sudden the speckled red that they had lost started coming back. And so, you know, you never know like what can come back. Nothing I think is ever truly lost, but it's just you have to do the work to get there without steering the land. Yeah, I think that our landscapes will drastically change. Obviously, climate change will be even faster track than it is now. And yeah, definitely a loss of diversification, both in seeds, agriculture wise, and also like, yeah, across the board as plants and animals, and ultimately us, if we're not careful.
Thank you for that. It's something to, sometimes people are like, I don't really find a purpose, or I don't really see my connection to being interconnected in this way. And I think that you wrapped it up pretty well. Is there anything else you would like to add? And if there's other like handles or ways that people can reach you and connect with you as well, if that's something you're interested in.
Yeah, I'd say I would definitely promote the publication and gathering basket from the I Collective. I worked as the image curator on that, but it's a really great resource. We started that up in 2020 once obviously the pandemic hit and we couldn't go and travel and cook as much anymore. But it's by issue now. We're hoping to get it actually published in a physical copy at some point. But each issue deals with different things. Like, for example, we take like a traditional plant or ingredient and then kind of use it as a jumping board. So like the first issue is about yucca. And Carlos Baca, who's he's Utiwa and Dene, he wrote, I think, the majority of that, but he talks about how yucca, you can use all parts of the plant. The roots are good for washing your hair. The stems and the leaves, I believe, they use for weaving. And he talked about even how like you used to know whose land you were on because each family had a different like weave in the sandal. So even by looking at the footprints like on the ground, like you know like whose land you're on because you see that family's weave. And then of course like the flowers are edible too. And he used that as a jumping off board to talk about how there's a particular valley where the women used to go out and gather, and you can hear them singing throughout the whole valley. But then like once people came in, like the settlers came into the valley, they ended up attacking the women. And then the valley got renamed to Squaw Valley. And so talking about like the whole conversation about the word squaw and, you know, and obviously like colonization and things like that. And then eventually it was renamed. So it's like kind of like that thing, like we take an ingredient or plants or animal or fish and then talk about different things. Like even with the walleye, we talk about like, obviously there was the fishing wars in the Northwest, but there was also fishing wars in the Great Lakes. So talking about that war up there as well. So it's a pretty dope publication and there's recipes in that as well. So if you don't know about like how to use an ingredient, you can check that out. I would also say the Facebook group Food Sovereignty is Tribal Sovereignty, which is a native only group. If you have a question about a certain ingredient or anything like that, or like plant, animal, style of doing something, you can always go and look in there. I think it has like the largest collection right now of information about traditional foods, as well as like everything from like, you know, people growing or hunting or fishing to like organizations and things going on. So it's a pretty great resource. But in terms of finding me, you can find me on Instagram at Nita Ohoyo. So it's NITAOHOYO, or my website, nitaohoyo.com. But I have a lot more of like my art and beading stuff on there, but I'll probably post some like food stuff on there as well at some point.
Thank you so much for your time and for channeling in. And I hope your move to Texas went smooth and you're acclimating. Hopefully you get to come visit us from time to time. It's good to share space with you.
Yeah, good to see you. And thank you for inviting me on.